Baba, welcome to this week's episode of Ghana in Focus with myself, Kwame, Ghanaian writer, broadcaster, journalist, podcaster, and entrepreneur. And in this week's edition of Ghana in Focus, we're looking about the housing crisis that is in Ghana right now and how it affects you as someone living in diaspora, particularly if you want to buy or build a property in Ghana. Okay, so we're looking at this very crucial issue about the housing crisis in Ghana, particularly in Accra. So there's a big housing problem in Ghana, and we're going to, explore some of the issues at hand. All right, so before we get into this week's podcast, if you like what you hear, please share to your friends, family, social media networks. Subscribe to Ghana Africa in Focus on YouTube. Subscribe to Ghana Africa in Focus on Spotify. I want to get as many subscribers as possible, so please share it to your friends and family. And if you want to donate to the show to help us continue to bring some great content from Ghana and from the African continent, you can subscribe from that's $3 a month, and you can click the link to donate. That's $3 a month. It could be a one-off payment or a monthly subscription. It's entirely up to yourselves. All right, so let's get into this week's podcast, looking at the severe housing crisis in Ghana. So there is a massive housing crisis in Ghana, and what's compounded that is that right now, as we're speaking, estimates say 2 million, but I doubt it. For me, someone that's lived in Ghana and knows how the market and knows what housing is like in Kumasi, Tenant, and Accra, and the lack of new housing. For me, the deficit is around about 4 to 5 million units. Yeah, so that is the amount of housing units that need to be built in Ghana to equalize with the rapid growing population, particularly in Kumasi and Accra. And that leads nicely to rapid urbanization. So in the last 15, 20 years, there's been rapid urbanization of Accra, but I'll come on to that in a minute. Also, speculative luxury development, weak rent regulation, high mortgage rates, and economic inequality are the reasons why, there's a housing crisis in Ghana. So let's take these one by one then, as we go into detail, examining and critically analyzing the housing crisis in Ghana. So, as I mentioned, there's a severe deficit. So Ghana faces a nationwide shortage of around between 4 and 5 million housing units, especially in Accra and Kumasi. Urbanization and population growth has outpaced construction of affordable homes, and we'll come on to the construction of affordable homes as the podcast evolves. Now, let's look at luxury-focused development. Now, developers concentrate on the high-end apartments and gated communities or gated estates communities in areas like East Legon, Airport Residential Area, and cantonments. These homes target immigrants from outside the African continent and within the African continent, diaspora buyers, and elites, leaving ordinary Ghanaians priced out, yeah? So you Ghanaians listening to this podcast here in Ghana, many of you cannot afford to buy property because, particularly in Accra, because most of the properties are priced in US dollars and most of you earn in Ghana cedis. Yeah, so there's obviously that disparity there. Now, what makes this issue of housing crisis in Ghana more compelling is that despite the deficit of between 4 to 5 million units, yeah, believe it or not, there are more than 1 million homes in Ghana that are unoccupied, yeah, particularly in Accra and Kumasi, yeah. And again, we'll come on to that, as the podcast, develops. So if there is 4, 5 million shortage, why is there more than over 1 million units, vacant? Yeah. Also, what compounds the issue, like I said, is a chaotic rent system. So in Ghana, because and there are rent laws in Ghana, but because they're not enforced, landlords often demand 2 to 3 years rent upfront. Okay, so even those of you from the diaspora who have gone to Ghana to live, yeah, for a while or permanently, have discovered that, yeah. So it's not like in the UK, US, Canada, where you pay your rent on a monthly basis. No, in Ghana, because the rent laws are not enforced, landlords can charge anything they want and take, as a normal case, between 2 to 3 years advance rent. Yeah. So for example, you're renting a property, let's say you're renting a 1-bedroom flat in a, let's give it a nice part of Accra. So, you want to have those same UK, US, or Canada standard, yeah? So you're going to rent an apartment in a nice area in Accra for, let's say, $1,500 a month, yeah? A 1-bedroom apartment, yeah? $1,500 a month. So you need 2 years rent advance. So that is 36,000 US dollars that you need just for your rent, yeah? And that house may not be fully furnished. So we're not even talking about furnishing your property, buying a car, or whatever, right? You need $36,000, yeah, as an example, to hire or pay in advance a 1-bedroom flat or apartment in a nice affluent part of Accra. Yeah. So this compels the the housing crisis that we're facing in Ghana today. So, so because of this anomaly of paying upfront here, these upfront charges it's like a burden trap, because low to middle income earners, Ghanaians, cannot afford this, and it forces overcrowding and also unstable living conditions and arrangements. Now, again, weak mortgage market. Again, we'll go into this in a bit more depth. So Ghana right now, the mortgage facility in Ghana is not as developed as it is in the US, UK, or Canada, yeah? So in Ghana today, mortgage penetration is under 1% of GDP, yeah? So it means that the mortgage market in Ghana is very, very, you could say very, very low, and it's like a virgin market compared to, Europe and North America. Now, interest rates are crippling, yeah? As of this podcast, yeah, interest rates for CD loans, yeah, are between 29 and 31%. This is despite, the Bank of Ghana base rate dropping from 25% in January this year to around about 20% now, or just under 20% today. There's going to be another Bank of Ghana meeting this week to see if interest rates will go further down, or if they'll stay the same, or they may go up. But for now, this has had adverse effect on the cost of borrowing in Ghana. So if you want to get a mortgage in Ghana, right, a city paid in cities here, you are going to pay between 29 and 31% for that city loan. Now compare that to 13% for mortgages in US dollars. So if you buy a property, right, say for example, $20,000, yeah, that mortgage in Ghana is 13% for dollars. And mind you, most people in Ghana don't get paid in US dollars. You get paid in cedis. So you have to convert the cedi into dollar in order to qualify for that 13% US dollar loan. Yeah. And this rates, high rates, one could say, is also compelled or compounded by the currency instability. Yeah. That discourages long-term borrowing, because one moment the cedi could be 10 to a dollar, next moment it could be 15 to a dollar. So it kind of discourages long-term borrowing. But if you've listened to the podcast this year, you would appreciate that the Ghana cedi has stabilized a lot this year. So at the beginning of the year, it was 15 Ghana cedi to $1 US. Today, as speaking, that's about 12 cedis to $1. It went as low as 10, at its peak in around about April, May. But obviously, it's going up slightly because of the fact that importers now, we're getting for Christmas in Ghana, and importers are now importing a lot of goods into the country, meaning that there's demand for dollars. So this is why now the Ghana cedi is now 12 cedis to $1. All right, so let's look on further, as again, going deeply as to why there's a housing crisis in Ghana. So in Ghana, there's also socio-economic inequality, yeah? So the average wage in Ghana, I'm not talking about the super rich, talking about the majority of Ghanaians, their average wage or the annual average income in Ghana is roughly between 50,000 Ghana cedis and 70,000 Ghana cedis per year. So in US terms, that's about between $4,000 and $6,000 a year. That's the average salary that most Ghanaians, earn in Ghana. Yeah. So these meager salaries cannot match house prices in Accra, particularly prime areas, which is equivalent of between $500,000 and $1.4 million. Yes, indeed. That's how much expensive, yeah, property in Ghana or property in Accra, particularly prime areas like airport, residential area, East Legon, Laboni, Cantonments, Ridge, etc. That's how much these properties are. Yeah, they can match with Atlanta, Connecticut, parts of New York, parts of District of Columbia, parts of the leafy bits of Connecticut. Yep, house prices in the 9 cities of Accra is not cheap. Yeah, and so because of this sort of inequality between the money that Ghanaians get as a salary, just opposed to the house price in Ghana, makes prices that many Ghanaians, yeah. So many Ghanaians cannot afford to buy property, which compels the housing crisis in Ghana because there's no affordable scheme in Ghana whereby the ordinary Ghanaian can buy a house. And that for me was one of the big no-nos of the recent budget that took place in Ghana, that there was no deliberate housing strategy as to how this government is going to build affordable housing for the ordinary Ghanaian. But we'll come on to that later on. So, as mentioned, right, this wage to house price gap is one of the widest globally. So Ghana has one of the widest wage to house gap prices in the world, yeah, which again compels the housing crisis in Ghana, meaning that many Ghanaians dream. It's a dream for them to own their own property, which is why you see in Ghana today, many ordinary Ghanaians are actually taking 20 years to build the property, such as the nature of affordable housing in Ghana, and also such as the nature of the current housing market in Ghana, which is heavy dependent on luxury side of the department or real estate. So not affordable, not for lower middle income people, but for the higher market. That's what property in Ghana, particularly Accra, is focused on. Higher market. But again, we'll come on to that, in a jiffy. So there's been no sustainable affordable housing project since Nkrumah and Achampong. Achampong ruled Ghana between 72 and 78, yeah? So after 1978, there's been no deliberate, sustainable housing policy whereby the government is going to make provision to build affordable housing for Ghanaians, yeah? And that is a big issue within Ghana today. The lack of government will to build affordable housing. There's been some attempts by governments after Achampong, but those have not seen the light of day. So, for example, Kufuor did a project in Kumasi I can't remember what, so not Kumasi, the Asante region. I think it was Kwabre or somewhere like that. Affordable housing project that never saw the light of day. Again, at the Mills, he had an agenda to build some housing for affordable housing for Ghanaians, namely the Estates project. But again, there's a lot of corruption, and that never came to fruition. And under Mahama 1.0, he actually had a massive housing project at Saglime, which is outside Accra, that was near to completion when he lost the election in 2020. And since 2020, when Akufo-Addo came to power, he neglected that housing complex that Mahama started, in 2016, called Saglime, and that was left to rot in the bush. And today, it is still in the bush, but we gather that there are plans to actually resuscitate the Saglime project and try and complete it so that Ghanaians can get somewhere affordable to live. But like I said, the last conscious housing development project was under the Champong regime between 72 and 78. So at Champong, between 72 and 78, he launched mass housing schemes like the State Housing Corporation projects, And these projects were responsible for building two of the biggest estates in Accra, namely the Dansomai estate, which at the time was the biggest estate in West Africa. It probably still is. But at the time, when that was built in the 70s, Dansomai, that was basically the biggest estate in West Africa. Also, Achampong built under the State Housing Corporation project. He also built the Teshi Nungwa estate. Teshi and Nungwa is near the coastal line. So he built those two estates for the older Ghanaian to get somewhere to live, as opposed to today where we have, luxury apartments and houses targeted at immigrants and the rich and the super rich, and also the business class and the elite in Ghana. So Achampong, went on to build his houses, such as Nkrumah also, Kwame Nkrumah, 7-year development plan incorporated a housing project, whereby he initiated the State Housing Company that was later, developed by Achampong, and he also started the Tema Development Corporation. In terms of the Tema Development Corporation, that was responsible for the massive housing project in Tema, whereby that city was built from scratch. And within that city, he built 12 communities, community 1 to 12, which consists of basically housing types of all types: 1-bedroom flat, 2-bedroom apartments, 3, 4, 5-bedroom, houses for older Ghanaians to buy, because Nkrumah had this vision that obviously Tema was going to be the industrial hub of Ghana, so many manufacturers were built in Tema. So he said that also I'm going to complement that by building cheap housing, so that those workers at the end of the day can have somewhere to live, and which is why he built many houses within the Tema community 1 to 12 enclave, Also in Accra, Nkrumah built, cantonments, Laboni, Kanda Estate, Airport Residential Area, and the Samdown to again house Ghanaians in those early days after political independence from the British. So Nkrumah and Achampong had a deliberate housing policy because they understood that housing was a key component in the nation building process. But today, or since the Champong, all the leaders that came, particularly J.J. Rawlings, who were going for 20 years, they did not have, or did not see, or did not view housing as a nation building agenda. Yeah, they just left it to private, developers entity, and that does not work. Yeah. So, and that brings me on nicely to the private sector dominance. Yeah. So since the Champong and Nkrumah, yeah, Ghana has basically left housing to private sector dominance. And so since the 1990s, yeah, housing has been left largely to private developers who are speculating to make money. Yeah. And the way that they see fit, right, is to target diaspora buyers and elites by building luxury apartments and luxury houses in areas like cantonments, Laboni, East Legon, and airport residential area. Because for them, affordable housing yields lower profit. So that's been neglected. As far as they're concerned, they want to, develop luxury housing aimed at diaspora and also the elites. Yeah. So this is what has compelled the housing situation that we get in Ghana today. And so, a big reason why, since the Champong, these governments did not have a deliberate housing policy, and I'll check this, this is very, very important, because from the 1980s onwards, Ghana went to the IMF to get a loan, particularly on the rulings, yeah? And Ghana moved away from a hands-on approach to, to a more private sector approach. So when the Nkrumah and the Champong, right, it was state-led. So the housing developments were state-led. After a Champong, right, and particularly because Ghana went into the IMF structural agreement programs, right, Ghana moved away from that state-led housing to basically private dominance, yeah? So governments, since the Champong, were encouraged to let the private sector lead, focusing on, making the environment enable, so-called enabling environment, rather than direct provision. Also, because Ghana had been in a debt crisis, since the 80s, because of the coup that followed after Nkrumah and the Champong, right? The debt crisis and austerity limited funds for mass housing projects, yeah? So subsidized housing was seen as unaffordable for the state at the time because they were paying back debt and they also had to, embark on austerity measures based on the IMF and World Bank diktats. Again, corruption and failed projects is also a reason that's been compelled, like I mentioned earlier, as to why, there are more than 4 million housing deficit in Ghana. So corruption and failed projects. So as I mentioned earlier on, Kufuor's government between 2000 and 2008 had an affordable housing project in 2005. This stalled due to gaps in funding, yeah? So, and this is because of the way Ghana, manages the economy, that it became, liberalized. And so in order for Ghana to balance its books, Ghana to seek financial assistance, yeah, from the IMF and World Bank. And so housing projects that were meant to be implemented were stalled due to funding gaps. We can go into Mahama, as I mentioned, Mahama's Sagame housing project between 2012 and 2016. So that was, like I said, that housing project, right, was near completion, but it was not fully completed because of corruption and also, misappliances of those funds that should be used to complete the Sagame project. So because of this corruption and also the misappropriation of funds, yeah, many thousands of those units were unfurnished. Now, because of this void in housing policy, yeah, a deliberate housing policy, the elite then went into this area and saw a market. So they saw market in housing, not to reduce the deficit, but to build more you could say luxury apartments, luxury housing, not for the ordinary Ghanaian, but to make money. And to make money, you need the rich Ghanaians, the elites, and also immigrants coming from Asia, from Europe and North America. And so developers and politicians shifted their focus, right, from affordable housing, which for them was unprofitable, to luxury apartments and gated communities for the well-to-do, the diaspora, and the immigrant community. And as I mentioned, affordable housing was sidelined because those yields are low compared to the higher yields and more prestige developments targeted at the rich and the elite, and also the diaspora who have got the money to buy these properties. And as I mentioned also, the political will, someone like Nkrumah and Champong, where there was a deliberate housing policy, leaders like Rawlings, Kufuor, and others, they lacked that ideology-driven vision that Nkrumah and Champong had to see housing as a nation-building tool. And so, and because of this lack of vision, after Champong, that has created the void in terms of using the state to build these affordable housing units, concluding in the fact that there's more than 4 million deficit of housing that is needed for the older Ghanaian, particularly in Accra and Kumasi. And so, this is where we are today, where Ghana finds itself in a massive housing crisis because of, lack of affordable housing, and also the rent market in Ghana, whereby landlords charge 2-3 years advance, which has compelled many Ghanaians to seek alternative, you could say, accommodation. So in closing, and the way forward, and this is going to be in about 7 local bits and pieces. So the first one is for Ghana to re-establish a national housing vision, just like what Nkrumah did and what Champong did. So they're going to treat housing, right, as a pillar of nation building, not a side issue. Create a national housing policy with binding targets, i.e., we're going to build 200,000 affordable housing units per year. And that's why I say in the budget, that was mentioned. There was no national housing policy with targets. This is what is needed in Ghana if this deficit of 4 to 5 million is going to come down. Again, number 2, as a way forward and closing, focus on affordable supply, not luxury. Redirect state incentives away from luxury estates toward low and middle income housing. Because believe it or not, that's where the money is. Low and middle income housing is where money is made in Ghana, not these luxury flats, because like I said, as I mentioned at the beginning, most of these flats are empty. You drive by at nighttime, drive by airport residential area, drive by Laboni, Cantonments, East Legon, Ridge, Jowolu, and you will see rows and rows and rows of empty houses. Why? Because people cannot afford to rent these houses. Because like I said, the rent laws in Ghana, landlords charging 2, 3, sometimes 4 years in advance, on a $1,500 a month property, And so the government must focus, right, from luxury estates toward low middle-income housing, which sits right for the majority, because the majority of Ghanaians are low to middle-income earners. So if you have a housing policy that is geared towards that market, right, you're going to make a lot of money. Again, what government should do is to partner with cooperatives, create unions and community developers to build incremental affordable units, because we know that the banks in Ghana don't see that vision, right? And they're not going to lend money to government to build affordable housing. So that's got to be something that the government's got to look at alternative strategies and ways in which to partner with cooperatives and others to build affordable units. Again, in closing, rent reform is a must in Ghana. So there needs to be, there's laws in Ghana, but like I said, these laws now need to be enforced against charging 2 to 3 years rent up front. That is illegal under our laws, and so forth. It must be enforced. Yeah. So that rents, at least according to the rent laws in Ghana, is 6 months. So landlords should not be charging more than 6 months advance. Yeah. And that needs to be enforced. And any landlord who breaks that law should be imprisoned. Yeah. Or even, banished from the country. Yeah. Because these lax laws is compelling the housing crisis that we see in Ghana, particularly in Accra, Kumasi, and to an extent, Tama. Again, government must introduce monthly rent schemes supported by government-backed guarantees, i.e., like, if you buy a house, like what Mr. Thatcher did, if you pay your house monthly by month, right, you could then buy that property, in the long term. This is what Mr. Thatcher did with her rent to buy scheme in the 1980s, whereby many, many council properties in England were bought by the tenants after they paid rent for a certain amount of period. Yeah. But unlike in other countries, that money that the local authorities in the UK got from selling council properties was not used to build more affordable accommodation in the UK, which is why in the UK also has a massive housing crisis, that is leading to many people wanting to leave the UK because of lack of decent housing. But that's for another time. Again, government must unlock land and finance. There's a massive issue in Ghana with land tenure, because a lot of land in Ghana is owned by the stool, family, clan, etc. And so government needs to streamline land administration to reduce disputes and corruption. Again, government must expand the mortgage facilities in Ghana, because like I said, the mortgage, quote unquote, industry in Ghana is very, very small as compared to US, UK, Canada, and is very, very limited to basically to diaspora and rich people. And so the government needs to expand mortgage access with single-digit interest rates through state-backed schemes like rent to buy. Also encourage diaspora remittances to flow into community housing projects, not just luxury builds. Also, in closing, and a way forward, there must be a public-private balance. So government should lead with mass housing estates, while private developers complement that with mixed income projects. Yep. And Ghana can learn from Singapore's Housing Development Board model that is state-led, affordable, and high-quality housing. Again, in closing, there must be urban planning and infrastructure. Integrate housing with transport, schools, and healthcare, because right now in Ghana, particularly in a lot of these, non-affluent areas, there's no real great planning infrastructure. So people just build on waterways, build where they want. Yeah. And that is also causing environmental chaos in particular Accra, whereby you have perennial floodings because people are building on waterways, yeah, not planning. And so the urban planning must be enforced, in particular in Accra and Kumasi, to integrate housing with transportation, schools, and healthcare. Again, going forward, government must build satellite towns around Accra and Kumasi to ease pressure on prime neighborhoods. So, like I said right now, particularly in Accra and Kumasi, there's a, repatriation from the rural communities to Accra and Kumasi, which is causing an overflow in both those two cities, and that's leading to massive traffic in Accra and Kumasi. Also, putting pressure on the, little infrastructure that there is, whether it's schools, whether it's universities, whether it's transportation, whatever, because of this urban immigration or urban migration into the major cities, it is putting pressure on local communities. And finally, in going forward in this, there needs to be transparency and accountability. Yet to avoid repeats of Sagame and the Kufuor Housing Project by ensuring open procurement, community insight, and anti-corruption safeguards. Yeah, whereby people who misspend or malfeasance state funds are dealt with in the appropriate manner. All right, so this has been Ghana in Focus with myself, Kwame, looking about the housing crisis in Ghana. And I hope you've enjoyed it. And this is why housing is expensive in Ghana, because there's lack of new housing. Yeah. And so basically, the housing that is being built by private developers, they're seeking profit. Yeah. So this is why in Ghana today, in the DC area, particularly Accra and Kumasi, but particularly Accra, yeah, because most people from the diaspora want to live in Accra, particularly the prime areas, housing starts at $500,000. How many of you in the diaspora have got $500,000 to buy a decent property in the affluent area? So like I said, this housing crisis in Ghana affects you also because it makes buying property, particularly in the affluent area, very, very expensive. And also building materials has gone up in Ghana, particularly since COVID. Yeah, they've tripled, quadrupled in a lot of instances, like cement, iron rods, paint, etc. And also the sanitary products, sanitary ware that is used to furnish the properties. So again, compelling the housing crisis in Ghana. So if you are a diaspora, listen to this podcast. I hope you found this podcast very, very useful tool for you to get some detail as to why there's a housing crisis in Ghana and why that is affecting you as somebody from diaspora when you are coming to Ghana to either rent or buy a property. All right, so we've got some great stuff coming up for December. So next week, we're going to look at tourism, because it's that time of year again, coming to Christmas. We're not going to talk about Dirty December. We've done that, last couple of years. But we're going to look at next week, we're going to look at Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, one of the most beautiful cities in Africa. We're going to be looking at that. And also towards the end of the month, we'll be looking at the Africa Cup of Nations that is going to be held in Morocco in the next couple of weeks, going through to late January, early February. And also we'll be looking also at the review of the year, both in Ghana and also the African continent. So those are podcasts over the next few weeks. So for myself, Kwame, and from the crew here on Ghana in Focus, is thank you very much for listening. And we'll see you in the next edition of Ghana in Focus.